Hey everybody, so today we're going to get into yet another three-part series of my industrialism videos here. And here we're talking about the impacts of the Industrial Revolution, and there are quite a bit. And a lot of this stuff I'm going to talk about focuses on Britain, because again, this is where it was all happening. We'll get to more continental stuff later, but these three videos, for the most part, are all Britain. And you can really just see the parallels happen in a lot of other countries as well, okay? They all have to go through it. Okay, and again, I'm talking about population, and I have to keep population because again, it's going through the roof even more. Okay, and 1750, again, about 140 million people in Europe, and then by 1850, we're at 266 million. Okay, and birth rate is actually not the main issue here. The birth rate actually goes down. But more or less, we actually have more overall food available because of the transport of it, and we've talked about that in the second wave of the agricultural revolution. And the other deal is we actually have some people dying of disease less and war. Okay, the wars are less frequent. They're building up more immunities to these diseases like the plague and smallpox, although we'll have some other diseases that wreak some havoc as well. And again, so everything's, going pretty good. But there will be a problem, and a lot of the problem has to happen with landless peasants, okay? By 1850, still only about 45% of people are involved in manufacturing. And they're really just concentrated in a few areas, okay? There are some local issues as well. And what I mean by that is that in certain areas, particularly rural areas, you have overpopulation, okay, because you have millions of peasants who don't own land. Talked about the enclosure movement already. And a lot of them struggle with just getting a job, okay? And so as a result, you will get a lot of movement. So that's an interesting thing about the Industrial Revolution. And there will be some things that it improves, but it's actually going to make people move around, particularly from Britain and quite a bit from Germany as well. Okay, so we have immigration and emigration. Now, these aren't problems, okay, but this is just issues and people needing to find jobs, okay? There will be mass immigration, particularly to the United States. The Irish and the Germans, just to give you an idea, between 1847 and 1854, 1.6 million Irish leave and 955,000 Germans leave. Now, a lot of the Irish movement will because of the Irish potato famine. I'm going to try to create a separate video for that. It was awful, and some people you could argue it a genocide because of specific inaction by the British government, but it was awful, awful, awful. And the Germans, there's a lot of disorganization, but you've got this population, and then you also have emigration, in other words, people moving within Europe trying to find jobs. Okay, so you can find, French in different places, and Germans in a lot of different places, and Italians in a lot of different places, and that's going to be an interesting thing that we have happen. And again, that's the problem of having this big population boom, but not necessarily enough jobs. As much as industrialization did try to do that, it didn't always address it. Now, the big thing here that I'm going to focus on today is the growth of cities, and they're going to grow at a very fast rate. Just to give you an example for some growth, okay, because they are centers of trade and manufacturing. Okay, so for instance, in 1800, England had one major city, London, that was over 1 million people. And then it had about 6 cities with a population of about 50 to 100,000 people. Okay, that's a lot of people. However, in 1850, all right, London will have 2.6 million people. There will be 18 cities from 50 to 100,000, and then another 9 over 100,000. And what this is showing us is that this is now the movement of where the jobs are at, and people want to live in and around cities. And the urbanization of the countries are growing at a rapid rate. And it's not really going to slow down anytime soon. And by 1850, you're getting 50% of the population living in and around the cities. Okay, the rest of the continent is going to follow. It's not going to follow at as big a pace, but it is going to start to move in those directions. So what was it like living in the cities? Because this is really the biggest impact, I think, early on of industrialization. Now, if you're in the wealthy or the upper middle class, basically the idea is you stay away from the center of the city, because the closer to the center of the city you got, it could get really, really bad. So you're either on the outskirts of the city or in suburbs. Okay, so we will have the development of small towns, and many of which are for the wealthy. If you're living in the city, you want to be fabulous. On the right, that is a Victorian townhouse. Yes, that is what they call a townhouse. And so it's got like a wall and a little garden. So that's the whole idea. You did want to have some outdoor space to like show that you were still wealthy. Certain areas of the city would be patrolled a little bit more. In some cases, they would even put the wealthy section of the city on elevated areas, and sometimes the cities would kind of morph into two different things. You would get these one area which would be kind of the wealthy that would become almost its own city, and then where the poor live, they wouldn't really get a lot of help, and that would eventually develop into its own city. And so you see these types of things, and so you're still going to have very expensive homes with lots of cool stuff and flaunting it if you can. You can have a driver, you get around by horse and buggy in the city, whereas the commoners don't do that. Um, and that's really, really important for them. However, most people are poor or barely above poverty, okay? And that's going to be an issue as we continue to develop. And so, what is it like for them? Well, it's tight. Because here's the deal, there were so many people flocking to these cities, they were not prepared for it. And you're going to get certain sections of cities like the Whitechapel section of London and others that they just have to throw stuff up in these tenements and row houses and just hope for the best. So it was very cramped and very crowded. You see, these are some row homes. Okay, you get a bunch of different people that are living there. Okay, oh, and you get that constant coal haze, so that's important too. And here's just another idea. You can see, on the right, that is an apartment. So a woman and her two children. I mean, they had a cat, so that was cool. But I mean, that's the whole apartment, and you can see like the plaster and everything's just kind of thrown up there. And here's a woman. You got a couple babies here. Okay, you see everything is kind of jammed in here, and it's just tight and tight and tight. And shockingly enough, when it's tight, you don't have good sanitation. I mean, so here's a picture. This kid, we have these kids playing, right? This is in the 1800s, okay? Oh, what's that? That's an open sewer. They don't have shoes on. It's an open sewer, okay? So that's just filth and oh my goodness, it's just awful. And because the problem is like you don't even have most homes, they don't have actual bathrooms. You would get like one bathroom for everybody, and again it would go into an open sewer. And if you look on the right there, that's a dead horse. There's just a dead horse. Like, anybody gonna move the horse? Here's a quote just to give you an idea. A court is an area of like a group of homes. So the courts are extremely numerous. A very large portion of the poorest classes of inhabitants reside in them. The courts vary in number of houses which they contain, from 4 to 20, and most of these houses are 3 stories high and built, as is termed, back to back. There is a wash house, an ash pit, and a privy at the end. So again, for 4 to 20 houses, one privy, okay? On one side of the court, and not unfrequently one or more pigsties and heaps of manure. Delightful. Generally speaking, the privies in the old courts are a most filthy condition. Many which we have inspected were in a state which renders it impossible for us to conceive how they could be used. They were without doors and overflowing with filth. Awesome. And don't forget, if you notice, you see all that, like the haze back here, because remember, everything, we're burning coal, so you got cloudy skies, you've got soot everywhere, it's in the lungs, bad health, and then you get things like, I mean, look, that's all coal. God help us. And shockingly enough, you get disease, and one of the bad ones that will go through and really across the world at this time is cholera, because it turns out cholera spreads through bacteria, mostly in feces, but you get feces infested water, and it's awful. And basically, you dehydrate because you have diarrhea and you throw up so much. We do know how to treat it. There are things that we can do to treat cholera today. Believe it or not, most of it is that to actually trying to keep eating as much as you can, like not throwing stuff down, but to keep food in your stomach. And then, of course, hydration, lots of fluids and stuff like that. Okay, and you can see here, be temperate in eating or drinking around vegetables and unripe fruit, because turns out the water that was used to water them was infected. Shocker. You got to heat your water. Take a minute and look at that. It's just, oh, it's awful. Oh, and then we have other food concerns. Food was often dangerous and adulterated in cities, so they would basically foist off just junk to the poor, like beer and milk would be watered down. They would put chemicals in bread to make it look nicer, and just like alum, which you're not supposed to eat, but whatever. They would even use like lead as seasonings for stuff, like red lead instead of pepper. There was no government involvement in protecting these areas. So, it was really, really rough. Okay. And in all honesty, the question is, do you even help the poor? And one thought was, well, no. Okay. No, it's just that's the way that it is, and you're not evolved, you're not successful, so oh well. Thought number two was kind of. Now, what do I mean kind of? Basically, the poor were looked at as a bunch of criminals. And I have their concerns in quotes. There was a guy by the name of James K. Shuttleworth, and he was a politician. He was involved in a variety of different things, and he said that of the poor, that they were volcanic elements by whose explosive violence the structure of society may be destroyed. So the idea, now, don't get me wrong, in areas of high poverty, there's high crime. Why? Well, shockingly enough, if people don't have options to feed themselves and take care of families and stuff, they often turn to crime. And the idea here is that the police really didn't go in these areas. They patrolled these areas to make sure that the poverty people wouldn't get out. So they were almost kind of kept in like a prison thing. So it was like, all right, we'll just leave you, and your horrible group of people just can be there, and we won't help you. And this is an issue that has gone on through many, many years. It's why we still have inner cities today, and we'll talk about that. And then they passed something called the Poor Act of 1834 in Britain. And the idea here is what it did is it created so all of these living conditions and stuff like that, and for the poor, because you had many working homeless, like they had jobs in factories, but they didn't have a home, so they created these things called workhouses, which were basically like a prison. If you look on the picture there, the center, you have benches where they would eat and sit, and on the right you would have these bunks. And basically, if you got a job in a certain factory, you would then have to live in their workhouse. The conditions were terrible. The sanitation was crap. It was cold. You had men and children in one. There would be women in another one. And the whole idea was to like pen them in. But there were some people that wanted to make a change, and one such guy was Edwin Chadwick. Okay, he's another British lawyer, and eventually he becomes a government official. He was the secretary of the Poor Law Commission, and so what he did is he was he was a lawyer, and then he decides to do these investigations, and he investigates like the most poverty-stricken areas of London basically for 3 years, and he publishes a series of reports, and he shows basically how like disease and cholera and all this stuff is linked through the living conditions that people live in, how they're all jammed in together, and water systems and other poor sanitation things. And as a result of his findings, okay, the Public Health Act is passed. And what that did is it creates a national board of health that has these basic standards. And what they do is they form local boards in cities and towns, and their job is to establish modern sanitary systems. Now, it's going to take a while, but you do have the recognition that we put people in better living conditions and make them healthier and can work more and give them opportunities to make money, then crime and those things can go down. And so there are some opportunities to be had there, and there is some turnaround, but it is going to take a while because most people are like that James K. Shuttleworth. I mean, he sounds like a bad guy or somebody that you would name to mock them, of like kind of the mean wealthy person. So like that is the prevailing view, but we're starting to get change. But nonetheless, I mean, one of the biggest impacts is the development of these cities, and cities all over the place, but there are some scary places. All right, guys, we'll move on and talk about some other things in our next video.